If the previous story we discussed on the channel, Dagon, is one of the essential early stories of H.P. Lovecraft, then The Tomb, by comparison, might be a story for Lovecraft completists only. Written in 1917 and first published in a 1922 edition of The Vagrant, The Tomb feels closer to the morbid Gothic confessionals of that other great titan of American terror, Edgar Allan Poe, than it does to the cosmic horror weirdness of works like Dagon, or later stories written as part of the Cthulhu mythos. The protagonist of the story, Jervis Dudley, narrates this sordid confessional from his confinement within a, quote, refuge for the demented. As he recounts the circumstances of his young life, from an isolated childhood unburdened by responsibilities, to his young adulthood and obsessions with the locked crypt that sits forgotten at the edge of his family's estate, he shares with the reader recollections of the strange and inexplicable premonitions that bring the ghosts of the past intruding upon the character's lived and present reality. From the outset, the confessional framing device is a characteristic Lovecraftian motif, familiar from many of the author's most celebrated stories. That Jervis is recounting his experiences from what we assume to be a psychiatric facility hints briefly at the usual ambiguities of Lovecraft's writing, where an encounter with something cosmic or supernatural can be read as either a literal manifestation of the uncanny, or instead could be interpreted as a symptom of the character's perspective as an unreliable narrator. However, the story of The Tomb, at least in comparison to Lovecraft's later better stories, lacks the often audacious cosmic horror inventions that so often elevated his writing to something more singular and unique. Reading The Tomb back-to-back with Dagon was definitely interesting. Though the two stories were written and published around the same time, Dagon seems to have arrived fully formed. It has all the classic hallmarks of Lovecraft's later, more characteristic works in the Cthulhu mythos, making it a strong early introduction to the author's career. In comparison, The Tomb reads as the more naive or adolescent story. The debt of influence to other great horror writers, specifically the aforementioned Poe, is very much apparent throughout. Rather than feeling as urgent and fully formed as Dagon, The Tomb feels instead as if Lovecraft is struggling to find his voice, grasping at a style of horror storytelling that would eventually develop into something more distinct and recognisable, but without the innovations that gave his better, more famous stories their unique perspective. As a narrator, Jervis lacks the fevered hysteria and disbelieving uncertainty of Lovecraft's more engaging protagonists, recounting his strange dalliances with the supernatural in a somewhat bored and passive voice. Unlike the unnamed narrator of Dagon, for instance, who seemed to have been driven mad either by the trauma of war or by his encounter with a strange prehistoric deity of vague interdimensional origins, Jervis's grip on reality seems to have been strained since early childhood. His obsessions with death and physical decay, as well as his perspective as a loner or misfit, have already made him a figure of local urban legend, his very appearance inviting ridicule, suspicion, and even fear. This makes the character of Jervis something of a precursor to the character of Wilbur Whately from Lovecraft's 1929 story, The Dunwich Horror. Another character who seems to have been touched by something unnatural or unearthly, and whose nighttime wanderings and communing with the dark forces that are beyond any rational human comprehension make him a pariah within the neighbouring communities. This comparison at least gives the story some interest as an early variation of what would eventually become one of Lovecraft's most famous stories. However, the comparison between the two only highlights the shortcomings of the story in question, underlining its perspective as an early work by an author, not yet fully in command of their creative voice. One of the enduring characteristics of Lovecraft's writing was that use of ambiguity. His protagonists are often presented as unreliable narrators, people driven to madness, addiction, or destitution by their apparent encounter with the supernatural. That his characters are literally traumatized makes these encounters open to interrogation. Were these really encounters with the supernatural? Or is the supernatural in this context a symptom of trauma? However, the ending of The Tomb seems to suggest that the supernatural element of the story has more than a grain of truth. This takes away the psychological implications of the story and the usual ambiguities that open up Lovecraft's writing to more interesting interpretations, reducing it instead to a very surface-level ghost story in the greater traditions of Poe and other writers, like M.R. James. While The Tomb certainly reads like the early work of a writer still finessing their creative influence and their own burgeoning literary identity, I did enjoy some of the descriptive passages. The story has a definite atmosphere that is both suggestive and quietly captivating, and the account of the story is rich in visual evocations of twilight cemeteries, woodland hollows, and decaying mansions left forgotten by time. But the horror here doesn't feel as authentic, unique, or as fascinating as the cosmic horror conspiracies or encounters with ancient interdimensional forces, which define so much of that characteristic Lovecraftian style. Either way, these were my thoughts on The Tomb by H.P. Lovecraft, the second story in this collected anthology, the H.P. Lovecraft Omnibus 2, Dagon and Other Macabre Tales. If you enjoyed this video and you'd like to see me discuss more writing by H.P. Lovecraft, or more cosmic horror stories in general, then let me know in the comments. As you know, I don't normally review the same types of books back to back, as I usually prefer to have a bit of variety in terms of what I read, and also in terms of the kind of videos that I like to make. So my next few videos will likely be focused on different authors and genres. That said, I am always open to returning to something that I've previously discussed on the channel. Likewise, if you have any thoughts on The Tomb, or any thoughts on Lovecraft's horror in general, then I'd love to hear from you. Thanks for watching.